So, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gail Derin. And I was thinking about this, and I first met Gail in 2000. So that makes it about 19 years ago. But I'm only 22, so I'm not sure how that math works. Were we in kindergarten together? Could have been, yeah. I met her at Christ Unity Church when I was there on the board. And you were just working on your licensed Unity teacher at the time, yes. And your doctorate of Oriental medicine as well as yeah. So then I have the pleasure of taking my granddaughter to music class. And Miss Helen said something about her instructor, and I said, Gail Derin. And she goes, do you know Gail Derin? And I said, well, it depends. Tell me what she looks like. And she described you to a T. And I said, but tell me, is she radiant and does she emote spirituality and love? And she said, yes. And I said, then it's my Gail Derin. So we have a mutual friend, Miss Helen, who does music class. So Gail, we are so delighted to have you here. And let me invite you to step up, and I'll sit down. How about that?
Thank you. Wow, what an honor to be here. If you can't hear me, because sometimes I'm a little soft-spoken, just raise your hand, okay? It's so good to actually feel, there we go. Okay, thanks, Gordon. To be standing here, I feel really humbled. I mean, just thinking about Reverend Pearson, Reverend Cherie, Marty doing a great job, you being a wonderful steward of the Unity teachings, to be standing here. And many of you who have been true students probably longer than I've been a licensed Unity teacher or religious science minister. So I'm actually humbled to be able to do this today, and thank you for having me. I'm going to be working with two sources, and that is, how many of you know Eric Butterworth's Discover the Power Within You, Unity Classic? And the other is, I'm going to be speaking, I didn't know this, but just only a few days ago, I had a completely different talk, and Spirit said, no, you're not. You're going to be speaking about the prodigal son. And so I chose it from George Lomsa's Bible. Do you know who he is? He's an Aramaic scholar, which is the language, which was the time of Jesus. So there's some slight differences that I really like to go to his interpretation. So I'm going to be talking about that what is lost can be found, only sometimes a little different in how it comes back to us. And speaking of lost and found, it reminds me of a corny joke, because I always hear you start with a good corny joke. What do you get when you play country western music backwards? You get your dog back, you get your girl back, you get your truck back, you get your life back. So today's going to be about that, claiming what we may have felt that we've lost. And we're going to be talking about how this story of the prodigal son is our story for overcoming and for healing. So when I speak about God, for some of you it's a very personal relationship, and for other, God is principle. So whatever works with you when I speak about God, just take that in for yourself. So have you ever found yourself caught in a pattern that isn't working for you, or a situation that might have been robbing you of your joy or your peace? Now, being Unity students, I know that's none of you, but you may know of someone, okay? So today we're going to talk about sin and redemption. That doesn't sound like a Unity message, does it? Well, maybe. So we all know the term for sin, the archer's term meaning missing the mark of the bullseye. I've also heard it as saying sin is self-induced nonsense. But the Aramaic translation is unripe fig. That we are not ripened in our understanding, because if we knew better, we'd do better. Changes the whole meaning of sinner. So for me, the next time I screw up, instead of saying, "You wretched sinner," which I wouldn't do, but I might stand in front of the mirror and go, "You unripe fig." And I love that. I mean, being raised Catholic, it was all about judgment. And this sort of takes that out of it. Like, how can we be more ripened in our understanding of what we're facing? So Eric Butterworth says sin is the sense of assuming that you're separate from God. And our basic sin is not knowing who we are. Wow. And when we're not aware of the presence within us, don't we kind of default to our humanity? In physics, that would be saying that we're defaulting to the 4%. So what physicists are saying is that all of reality that we can perceive of our senses, what we can smell, touch, hear, taste, smell, is only 4%. 96% is in the invisible realm. And in Unity, we teach this. Everything goes from the invisible into the visible. Well, being that it's 96%, what would happen if we actually looked at the potential of what's actually there and actually explore that? That's what we're going to do today. But Butterworth says that we're not actually punished for our sins, but we're punished by them. And what he means by that is that when we feel that we have sinned or separated ourselves from God, what do? We cut ourselves off, don't we? And it's like drawing a blind going, "Where's the sun? It ain't around anymore. My luck is down and out. I'll never have whatever," when it's there all the time. So, the word redemption, part of the words comes from redeem, which means to claim, as to claiming a prize. So I'm going to go through the parable, and then we're going to take it apart. And sometimes when there's a parable in the Bible, I like to look at what came before. What was the setup that made Jesus decide to speak about that at that particular time? So it says in Luke chapter 15, "Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But the scribes and the Pharisees murmured under their breath, 'This man welcomes even the sinners and eats with them.'" So I think when Jesus gave these next 3 parables, he kind of had them in mind when he said it. And the first parable was about the lost sheep, the second about the lost coin, and the third about the lost son, or the prodigal son. So Jesus said, "A man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to him, 'Father, give me my inheritance, which is coming to me from your estate.' So he divided to them his possessions. After a few days, his son gathered everything that was his share and went to a far country. And there he wasted his wealth on extravagant, some scriptures say wild, living. And when all he had was gone, there was a severe famine in the country, leaving him in want. And so he went and he got acquainted with one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed his pigs. And he even craved to fill his stomach with the husks that the pigs were eating, because no one would give him anything. And when he came to himself, he said, 'Well, how many hired workers are in my father's house who have plenty of bread to eat? And here I'm about to perish with hunger. I will rise and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned before you and before heaven. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Just make me one of your hired hands.' And so he rose up and went to his father. And while he was yet at a distance, his father saw him and had compassion on him. And he ran and fell into his neck and kissed him. And his son said to him, Father, I have sinned before you and before heaven, and I am not worthy to be called your son. But the father instead stopped him and said to the servants, Bring the best robe you have, put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet, and bring the fat ox, and let us be merry and eat. For this my son was dead, and he has come to life. He was lost, and he is found. And they began to celebrate. But his older brother that was in the field could hear all this commotion going on. And as he came near the house, he asked one of the servants, because he could hear the voices of so many people singing. He said, What's going on? And he said, Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fat ox because he has received him safe and well. And the older brother became angry and would not come in. So his father went out to meet him and pleaded with him. But he said to his father, How many years have I served you? How many times have I served you and your commandments completely? And yet you've never even as much given me a young goat so I can feast with my friends. But for this son of yours, after he has wasted your wealth on harlots and came back, you have killed the fat ox. His father said to him, My son, you are always with me, and that all that is mine is yours. It's right for us to celebrate and rejoice, for your brother was dead and now has come to life. He was lost, but he's now found. Now that's kind of a sweet, bitter parable, isn't it? Butterworth says we must walk through the valley of the shadow of death and darkness, not stay stuck there. So today we're going to talk about 4 baby steps that we can take to help us go through that place. So the first step is to awake to the activity of the presence and power that is in us. Butterworth says that the Father and the Son are actually one person. It's actually our humanity meeting our divinity. And as we rise out of our limited consciousness, because aren't we, when we go into that far country, looking for love in all the wrong places? And then when we suffer enough, when we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, what can sometimes happen is if we face it and go deep enough, we come to ourselves. But before that, what does he do? He ends up feeding the pigs. Now, as a Jewish man, the pigs are considered unclean. So for him to actually be eating and sleeping with the pigs, it shows how low he actually went in his consciousness. And have you ever felt like there was no way out of a solution? And here it said there was no one to help him. Do you ever feel that Lone Ranger song playing? Or am I the only one? So Andrew Harvey, a radical Christian mystic that some of you know who he is, I was back at Unity Village in 2002 when he came, and he said this: everything in life is designed to fail you. So ultimately you turn within to find God. Wow, what a setup. So when the prodigal son forgets his divinity, he's left in want. But when he says, I go to the Father, I will rise up, what he's saying is, I'm going to go and meet the divinity within me. And then when he does, there's a surprise for him there, which I'll talk about in a minute. When he's able to go to that place, he's able to see other dimensions. He's able to see that there are actually hidden realities behind what the appearances are. So it's also about exploring the second unity principle. How many of you know what the second unity principle is? Can anybody tell us what it is?
Christ is within us.
Right, that we are a spark of the divine, and therefore our nature is inherently good. So I want, and I think of a spark of the divine, I think of a little sparkler on the 4th of July. But how many of you, if I were to say, where is the spark of the divine, where would you point to? So most of you are pointing to your heart, yes. But what about 3 inches outside the heart? Is the spark still there? Is there any place where God is not? And what does it say in Psalm 139? If I rise to the heavens or I descend down to hell, lo, I am with you. There is no place. That spark of the divine, when we think of, oh, there's just this little spark and here I am and there's God. We say, no. All of divinity dwells in this and in this. So when Jesus says, I go to the Father, he's saying, I go to dwell within the divinity within me. In 1 Corinthians it says, know ye not that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth within you. So the first step was to know that, I forget the first step. What was the first step? You're just testing me. To awake to the presence of the divinity within us. The second step is to look beyond appearances. To don't let the apparent block the real. So recently I was reading an article by Bob Cochran who wrote, What is real? And he was saying that matter is mainly made up of empty space, as we know in physics, and that there are force potentials. Do you know when they studied an egg, the embryology of an egg, they said that they found a heart, something pulsating, even before the heart formed itself. They say that the impulse starts and then matter forms around it. So just like our thoughts, feelings, decisions, they precipitate into matter. They congeal like rain. So he wrote an article called Who is Living in the Real World? And he talks about this little cocky caterpillar who is chastising the butterfly. And he goes, well, you're all flitting about. You're not living in the real world. He's living in the 4%. If you can't smell it, see it, touch it, taste it, well, it's not real. But the butterfly who's been through that stage kind of smiles, has some compassion on where that caterpillar is about to go. You know, a caterpillar has to actually be dissolved and surrender into goo before it transforms into a butterfly. How many times do we feel that we're being leveled into goo for something else to be happening in us, right? But the butterfly, what he calls the butterfly wisdom, is about we. It's about a win-win situation. Whereas the caterpillar is about win-lose. It's either this or that. It's either me or you. But the wisdom as we become ripened in our understanding is the we, is the and, is a way that it can actually be possible for everyone. He also said that we live in a very neuroplastic universe. We already know about the neuroplasticity of the brain, that we can actually change the brain and its memories given enough detail. Well, they say with every thought, with every feeling, with every impulse, we're actually morphing and shifting our universe. So he says, when you don't understand the power of your ability to shift and shape things, you're living in three-dimensional reality, which I call 3D, living in that 4%. But when we actually allow ourselves to be in the 96%, we actually move into the fourth dimension. And the fourth dimension is, with faith, to be able to see the whole. You know, in Christian Science, what they do is that when they're doing a healing, they see the illness as just a thin veil. And what do they see? They see the wholeness of that person when they're praying. When there's a cut finger, they see the perfection already in that finger. When they look at their lack, they see the prosperity that's already there in that fourth dimension. And that's what the butterfly comes to know, that they have to surrender that limited understanding that they're faced with and give it to a greater understanding. There was a young wizard apprentice who went to his professor, kind of maybe at Hogwarts school, I don't know, and he started telling him his problems. And at one point, the professor just stopped him. And he said, "You're trying to solve those problems in the third dimensional realm, rookie. Are we going to stay a rookie, or are we going to know that the teachings that we've already been blessed with studying and use them?" You know, when May Rowland came to Unity to be the director of Silent Unity, she was uncertain of herself. She did it for over 50 years, and she went to Charles Fillmore, and he said, "The Christ mind is in you. Use it. You'll know what to do." So the third step is to be able to keep the awareness of our divinity, we must forgive. You know, I look at forgiveness or unforgiveness as a clenched fist. It's also drawing the blinds. It's also that cutting off and shutting ourselves off. And you know, when you think about it, well, I'll get there in a minute. If we can't forgive, let's say something just seems really hard to forgive. A prayer I've used is, "God, I don't know how, but would you forgive through me? I don't know how to believe. Help heal my unbelief. Show me how to walk through the valley of the shadow of darkness. Forgive through me." And Martin Luther King says, forgiveness is not an occasional act. It's a constant attitude. And it happens because we actually can help transform others through our forgiveness by transforming ourselves. This is where the forgiveness first starts. And we give thanks in advance, even if we don't know or can see the bigger picture, even if we can only see that 4%. What did Jesus say? "God, I thank you in advance that you have heard me, and you have heard me always." What if we began to give thanks in advance for the caterpillar wisdom, for the butterfly wisdom that we cannot yet see, but we can already claim? When we do, we're going to find some amazing things begin to happen. And that fourth step, we have to, whatever we desire, we have to reach for it and accept it. We have to open ourselves to it. How many times have we had a prayer, but we don't look for it because it may not come in the exact same way we might have expected? And yet the answered prayer shows up. You know, 2 Sundays ago, I went to a church by accident. I was going for a tree planting service for a young father who was planting a tree on behalf of his little 2-month-old daughter. And I got there the wrong week. And so I decided to stay for the service. It's called the Journey Church. And one of the things he talked about was the Humpty Dumpty story. As we all know, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, which when I did some research was actually a political rhyme. But there was an earlier version, and a vision, which is Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. 80 men and 80 more could not put Humpty Dumpty back together as he was before. How many times do we want to go back to the before we were broken open, before the death of a loved one, or the illness, or the loss, or the whatever? And we have a choice here. We can either go back into that caterpillar understanding in that 4% and put ourselves back in a more distorted way, with cynicism, with resignation, with addictions, with distractions, with anger. Or we can face what we are feeling. And sometimes it means facing that pain that's waiting there for us and ask to be transformed, to be put together in another way. Maybe a way that later down the road, we won't even recognize ourselves because we're being ripened. We're being matured into a different understanding. We're being gooed in order to become that amazing butterfly. And so we have a choice. And out of that choice, it directs what we do and what we see and what we hear and what we respond to. Bruce Lee, who is a martial artist, and I've been a martial artist for over 40 years, so I have a special fondness for his work. He said, under pressure, we do not rise to the level of our aspirations. We fall to the level of our training. So as Unity students, we know that when we work with those principles, when we're under pressure, when we squeeze that sponge, we get to see what comes out. But we have to practice. And that, of course, is our time in the silence, our time with prayer, and our time with meditation. And I looked up the word prayer. And the word prayer in Sanskrit, the oldest language, is palau, which means to see oneself as wonderfully made. Wow. I could just imagine in Catholic school that I grew up with saying, okay, we're all going to come together in prayer, we're going to go within, and we're going to see how we are wonderfully made. What a difference that would have been. We used to say, Lord, I am not worthy, speak the word, and I will be healed. Except we never waited around to go find the healing. We just kept saying, Lord, I am not worthy. We are wonderfully made, and our prayer is to ponder that. And meditation is to dwell within that divinity. That there is no place, no person, circumstance where God is not. And when we go into prayer and meditation, there we enter into that fourth dimension, to be able to see from another perspective. Now what are we to do? How are we to face this? And so the end of the parable is with the older son and how it seems kind of tragic for him. Because what did he do? He did everything right. He obeyed the commandments, and then he sees this brother who walks away with his half of the fortune of his father, who squanders it. Now he comes back, and he says, well, what about me? You've never even celebrated with me in that way, and now you're giving him this big hoopla, and what did he do? And look at all that I've done. And in some ways, Jesus was talking to the Pharisees who were listening, who said, who is this man to eat with the sinners and speak to them? Because he says, don't look at the outer appearances. Yeah, we can do the right thing, but what's in our hearts? what the older brother realized, or didn't realize, or what the story points to, is that he could not forgive his brother or the father. What if he were to go into prayer and say, I don't know how to do this. You know, when our innocence is ripped away, or we hear about lives being ripped away, or when our security is taken from us, when we have to face the hard things, sometimes it's easier to make amends. But what if we're victimized by another, as the prodigal son's older brother felt? That's a harder lesson. In some ways, he becomes the prodigal son. He's got the journey to actually move through. How do I forgive when I don't know how? How do I face the betrayal that I feel from my brother and my father, who now is out celebrating? And so the father says, no, this is your brother. You are always with me. And so he has to take the journey to actually go deeper and to face some pain that wasn't necessarily of his own doing. And each of us have had that situation where we might have felt wronged by something, and we may feel justified in it. But if we don't surrender it to a higher understanding, who's the one that suffers? Who's the one that actually cuts themselves off from all of the bounty that the Father wants to give us? There's a Chinese proverb: we may not be able to prevent birds from flying over our head, but we have the right to determine whether we shall make a nest in our hair or not. So for just a moment, I'd like you to just close your eyes. And I want you to think of any situation that you might be facing. And say, Author of my being, I may not know how to forgive or even understand what has happened. Why this wrong, this loss, this illness, this seemingly mistake has happened in my life. I don't know how to move past it. Forgive through me. Move through me. Let me touch the very enormity of your being in me, and let me see that enormity in everyone and in everything. Help me ripen in my understanding so that I know that it's all God, pouring God into God. Amen. So in closing, you've been very generous listeners. This week, I invite you to see and discover that the full livingness of God is within you. Step 1, awaken to that activity of the presence of God in you. Step 2, look beyond appearances, beyond the caterpillar 4%. To the butterfly 96%. 3, keep the awareness of our divinity by forgiving, by blessing, and by releasing. And 4, whatever we desire, reach for it by being receptive. Accept it. Accept the full bounty that God has for you. Look for the blessings, and you'll find it. And as Einstein said, we have a choice. We can either see nothing as a miracle or everything as a miracle. And in honor of Margaret Stein, that many of you know, who had her recent transition, her favorite quote was, "It's all God and it's all good." So I invite you to turn to the person to the left and the right and say to them, "It's all God and it's all good." Thank you.